Hey everybody, I'm Rob Childs, Rapier swordsman out of the United States, and today's video is actually sparked by a question on a previous video that I did where I covered down on the technique called the lockdown. Now, in that video, I did a perspective of a right-handed fencer versus a right-handed fencer, but then someone out there in the internet webs had posed the question, hey, for us lefties out there, is it any different or do we do it exactly the same? Seems a little different. Perfectly valid question, so I'm going to cover down on that today. But if you're a right-handed fencer, this is also something you should still pay attention to, because even though I'm going to be talking about this from the left-handed's perspective, it is exactly the same technique if you're a right-handed fencer fencing against a left-handed fencer. And sooner or later, you're going to be facing that person in competition, and you're going to want to know how this works. But first, I just want to give a quick shout out to the following Patreon supporters. They are supporting the Patreon page Castle and Sword. In fact, these folks signed up within the first 24 hours, so it just goes to show you these folks want to see this castle rise just as badly as I do, and with help like theirs, we're going to get it done sooner rather than later. So in the video that I did on the technique of the lockdown, that was done from a right-handed versus a right-handed perspective. But this is just as important for you left-handed fencers as it is for right-handed fencers when you're dealing it from a left-handed perspective. Because you as a right-handed fencer perhaps are one day going to be fencing against a lefty, and you're going to want to know how to do this. So in this particular technique, I'm going to be pushing Lynn's sword to her outside line. Lynn is the left-handed fencer, I am a right-handed fencer. But it does not matter the sequence, whether or not it's left going against the right or the right going against the left because of the perspective. It'll be done exactly the same. But just as I had spoken in the first video, you're going to thrust the space, but not touch your opponent's weapon. From this position, you have gained the initiative against your opponent, and because you have not touched their sword, you have not triggered their defenses. In the next moment, now that my sword exists between me and my opponent's weapon, it is now safe for me to take the large step that will carry me forward, while simultaneously I push her weapon to the outside and down. But the pathway that you follow is slightly different than it is from a right-handed versus a right-handed perspective. In this particular instance, I'm going to push her outside and down as if there was an opponent standing off to Lynn's left. I'm going to shove that sword over and down in the direction of that imaginary person, where it looks just like this. Now that I'm here, I have her sword in the inferior position. My sword is above hers, I have the control position, my bell is lower than my tip, so if she was to press back against me, she would basically slide down into my forte, and I have even greater control. But let's assume that all of that doesn't happen in this particular instance. I'm going to continue from this position into the attack, which is going to be to the opponent's head or to the opponent's body. Now we're going to show you at what it looks like at speed. As always, starting with the proper measure is going to be key. It's going to be a little bit different depending upon your height, how long your sword is, the weapons combination that you currently have. But let's assume, keep it very simple so that way we can focus on the technique itself. Single sword versus single sword. At speed, it will be again, first going through the steps. Thrust the space. Once the sword exists between myself and her weapon, I can then proceed with my body to close the distance. And it'll look just like this. Thrusting the space, now that I'm here. Now in this first instance, understand that your opponent, because you put pressure on their blade, they are going to naturally, instinctively try to push back, which is going to cause a rigidity in the arm. You might even end up bending their body a little bit as they try to force their way back. It's not going to matter, they don't have the leverage, and it doesn't matter who you are, as long as you are executing this with the capture area of the sword, you are going to be the stronger no matter the actual physical strength difference between you. Now, given a preference of shoving your opponent's weapon to the outside line on the left-handed fencer or shoving them to the inside line, the preference that I have is shoving my opponent to that inside line because the angle that you ultimately end up with gives you a greater amount of coverage and control with your sword over theirs. And I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. But the demonstration of it whether you're shoving to the outside line or shoving to the inside line, is exactly the same. You're going to thrust the space, but this time I'm thrusting to the space on the outside of her weapon. And then, once I achieve this position, I then will move the body forward while my sword shoves her over and down, just like so. Now from here, it is very important, again, the bell of your sword ends up lower than the tip of your weapon. You now have your opponent in the inferior position. For this one brief instant of time, your opponent is going to go rigid for a moment, trying to refuse as you shove their weapon down. It's going to be for naught, but nonetheless, you will take advantage of that wasted time that they are pushing against your weapon in order to move into the next phase, which is to end your opponent with the thrust or the cut or whatever it is that you are inspired to do at the time. For me, I tend to opt for the thrust. And of course, covering with your open hand, your dagger, buckler, whatever it is that you have. One more time. Here. Just like so.